much, huh? Thank you. I'm honored to be here. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Casa Italia, for having this event. My name is Adam Kessel. Kessel's not an Italian last name. My father is Lakota and German. Lakota is the name of the tribe. My mother's Italian, from Calabria. So my grandfather, her father, was a huge inspiration to me growing up. And his name is Peter Zaffino. So you can kind of hear the Italian in that last name, right? Zaffino. And throughout my entire childhood, it was spent out there in Mineral Point, Wisconsin, hunting, fishing, gardening. And I'd never really realized how influential that was on my upbringing until I had children of my own. And it was so impactful for me. But really what the goal of this and the talk about my book and everything, I had to take some time to make this Italian connection. I'm like, because it's kind of implicit, right? It's a part of us. I didn't say I'm Italian. My grandpa was Italian. And I'm going to write a book about plants because, yeah, you know, it just kind of came to be. And as a teacher, I should back up a little bit. I'm a teacher. I was a public school teacher in Chicago. I taught at Al Raby High School, which was formerly Lucy Flowers, if you're familiar, Central Park and Lake, right by the Garfield Park Conservatory. I taught over there. I taught in Berwyn, and now I teach for the Cook County Forest Preserves, all about the environment and ecology and taking care of our natural resources. But what I wanted to start with was how plants create a story of the land. A story of the land, just like we're talking about Italian. I don't speak Italian. I'm third generation Italian. My grandfather spoke it fluently. I never knew. Until I married my wife, who's Mexican and speaks Spanish. I brought her. And they started speaking. She was speaking Spanish. She was speaking Italian. I'm like, Grandpa, where has this been? This is crazy. And they would just talk back and forth. My mother was never taught Italian because it was part of that process of assimilation, right? We're trying to live the dream. And I think that, speaking to your point, that American dream, right, and assimilation seem to be hand in hand. Could you have the American dream and then define your own Italian culture? It seemed like those things didn't always live in the same world. But if you want to go ahead and proceed, available on Amazon. I'm going to start with this picture. Southside Italians. Woo. We're at the Sox game, and if you go one more, there should be a picture of a mushroom. Oh, maybe not. Wrong picture. Let me see. There it is. Yes. Yeah. So this mushroom, I want to start with just putting it out there. When you see this picture, I'm not going to tell you anything else. What does this mean to you? What is this thing, this fungus among us? What does this mean? Does anybody have any observations? It could be anything. Just go ahead.
It's very good. I ate that.
You ate that, yes.
My grandfather.
Your grandfather.
Called it the signorina.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. See, so I'm speaking to my people. So when I do this, not everybody sees food, right? They see something else. I'm going to tell you a little story. This is my family's story about this mushroom. So when my great-grandfather, Raphael Zaffino, came from southern Italy, from Calabria, Spadula, he came to New York and eventually to Chicago, and they worked laying the railroad from Chicago to Mineral Point, Wisconsin. Once they got to Mineral Point, Wisconsin, everybody was out of a job. That was the end of the line. So everybody started working in the smelting furnaces there. Mineral Point lives up to its name. They mine for zinc and lead. And all the Italians there, along with other immigrants, worked in those mines and in the smelting furnaces. Now during that time, go back real fast. Back to the mushroom. It's all about the mushroom right now. So at that time in southwest Wisconsin, they were cutting down all the forests to make room for farms, right? They needed workable land, and forests weren't it. So there was a whole bunch of stumps just exploding with, this is called an oyster mushroom, right? And the story that I know that my grandfather told me, that when they were getting ready for the winter time, they would go out in early spring when these things were exploding, right? They were everywhere, and they would cut them, they would blanch them, and they would drive from Mineral Point, Wisconsin to Randolph Street to Asiago Cheese Company, another Italian-owned business, and they didn't get paid for it. They'd barter. So they'd get flour, they'd get sugar, they'd get things that would help them through the really cold and harsh winters of southwest Wisconsin. And that story carried through. When I was growing up, I'd just go for rides with my grandpa, and he would see these on trees. They could be in farmer fields, private property, we were kind of old school. And he'd be like, there it is. And we'd get out, we'd cut it down, we'd go back to the house, and we'd cook them up. And that was really an important part of our identity. And that was something that we held on to as part of our culture. Now, if you see this mushroom again, you're probably going to conjure up a different image of how this one little plant had a piece of Italian history in Chicago. Maybe for my family, it seems like everybody's had a little bit of it. Maybe our stories are a little bit different. But for me, plants are a way to tell history. The story of our people is in the land. And for me, my book was that. If you've ever taken a plant botany book with kids, it is dense. Kids don't like it. So I thought, how could I present botany in a really unique way where I could start telling the stories of these plants to kids? And I thought zombies were pretty intense, but kids like drama, right? So it's a plant identification guide with all non-native invasive species. So the idea is that even if we're going out and we're picking all these plants, we're still doing some ecological good. And all of them have stories that are associated with them. And that's kind of where we're going with the hike outside. As we move forward, we can go ahead. So those are my daughters, Isabella and Amelia Kessel. And I include this because when they were born, we were living in Pilsen. We were living a few blocks away from, if you go to the next slide, the Crawford and Fisk coal burning power plants. We're living in immigrant communities. They've been Italian, they were Lithuanian, but really they took on a lot of the pollution of the area. And when they were born, I was over at Loyola Hospital on First Avenue, not too far from here. And they were in the infant ICU, and the woman came through, the nurse, they're going through their normal routine. And they asked me the question, do you live next to a coal burning power plant? And I wondered why. Why are you asking me this question? Well, for infant RSV, which is like infant asthma, for preemies, their lungs are the last thing to develop. So the doctor asked me this question, or the nurse, and I said yes. And she said, oh my gosh, I've been doing this for 15 years. No one's ever said yes to that question. And I thought that was problematic. And I felt like at that moment, our communities are getting further and further away from the land, right? We don't know what's around us. We don't know what's growing up through the cracks. And that really was the impetus that got me started in conservation ecology and teaching about the environment. Let's fast forward.
Your daughters okay?
They're good. Here, I'm going to go to the next picture. Well, then we started the protesting. So here, I'm going to hop through here. We ended up going out there and trying to close those plants. Those are the girls now. Well, actually, that's kind of old. They're 12 now. They're quite big. And I have a little one named Catalina, and she's 6. But she's 6 going on 16. So with that, if you want to fast forward, the idea of this book, in its simplest form, is a way to revisit the land and teach the story of our people through our plants. And this can happen in many different ways because every invasive, well, let me back up, not every. Many of the plants that we would consider non-native, being not from this country, and invasive, are plants that were brought by different immigrant communities for many, many reasons. One of the best ways that I connect with my students, regardless of where they come from, is through food. I'm third generation Italian. I can't speak Italian, but I can eat Italian food like it's nobody's business, right? And that's one of the last things that we lose as we go through that assimilation process. My young ones, right? We say, what makes you think of grandma's house? What's that smell? And it's usually like, ooh, it's olive oil, and it's garlic, and it's oregano, and it's all these amazing things. And these culinary plants are the last plants that we lose our relationship with. Food is a great vehicle to teach culture, just as languages. So as we revisit the land, I wanted to share one, go ahead. Share one example. So I have a whole bunch of plants in this slideshow, and that was my plan B, just in case we got like a microburst or something crazy outside. But this is Holy Cross Church in the Back of the Yards neighborhood down south. And I'm including this. This isn't an Italian story. This is actually a story of a community that built this church. They were Lithuanian. And through my work, I do a lot of neighborhood walks where we talk about plants. And at this church, churches are really, really neat to look at the ecology of place, because the nuns loved to garden. And they planted plants that were very specific to their communities. Do you want to hit the next one? So as we walk, there's a beautiful little garden, and I came across this plant on the right. It was peculiar to me because when you start getting an eye for this, you start seeing plants that you see all the time. We'll go outside, we'll identify 5 plants, and when you go home, you'll see those plants everywhere because they're so prevalent. But this one I did, the one on the right, if you hit it again, it's called Russian Comfrey. Has anyone ever heard of Russian Comfrey? It's a very, very popular traditional herb in European folk medicine. So it actually brings down swelling. So folks would make baths of this. They'd make a hot bath and put Russian comfrey in it, and it would calm the muscles. It was like a muscle relaxant. And the entire garden was full of this. It was also really popular to use as a spring salve. And I can only imagine that the Lithuanian nuns that were there when this place was built, this was an important plant to them. And as you get in there and you get into these different spaces, you can start understanding history and understanding culture from the land, which is kind of a really fun perspective to take. Now, when I was teaching, the community there is no longer Lithuanian. It's mainly Mexican and Puerto Rican. But it became a talking point. So this plant was important to that community. What plants are important to your community? And again, I always circle it back to food, because sometimes I don't get a whole lot of participation when we're talking about plants. I'm like, hey guys, we're going to talk about ethnobotany. Eyes just kind of glaze over. But if I talk about food, oh yeah, cilantro, that's a big one, right? So that's one example. Go ahead. And there's some of the details of Russian comfrey. But I want to kind of hold back on all of this, because the real fun is outside. I can't say that I like talking about land and not do it in the land. So before I move on, does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns? I'll do one more pitch for the book. This year I did a teaching guide. So the idea was that we used pages out of the book, and we use flashcards as well, so that you can set up your own zombie gardening, foraging in a classroom. So the idea is that sometimes outdoor spaces can be a challenge, depending on where you teach. So we can also do this work in the classroom with the guide. So
This is probably a dumb question, but why zombie?
That's a great question. So it's inspired by, this was when I wrote this initially. Has anyone ever seen The Walking Dead?
Oh yeah.
Kind of a big horror movie fan myself, and my father loves The Walking Dead. Previous ones. He doesn't like the new season or the end of this season. But we were watching it together, and these people were running through the woods to get food. And I'm naming all the plants they're passing as they're running by. I'm like, this is silly. All the plants they need is right there. Why are they going with the zombies? And my dad said, you should write a book. So I did. So that's the story behind zombie gardening. 1 minute. All right. Any other questions before we wrap up? And then I welcome you all to come outside and join me. Yes, sir.
Any poisonous mushrooms you would recommend?
Oh. I'm sure there's those are the worst too.
Can I share a funny story?
Please,
Because I
please.
recognize that my grandfather used to go mushrooming, and he called it a signoria or something like that.
Mhm.
And my uncle, my mother's brother, his son, was never that attentive growing up. So at some point he decided he was taking up the family tradition of mushrooming. And so he would call my mother periodically and say, oh yeah, they found the mushrooms. And her first question to him always was, "Have you already eaten them?" You know, like, so he was offering them. "Do you want some mushrooms?" She goes, "Did you already eat them?" "Yeah, I'll have some."
I mean, that's the rule of thumb with foraging, is you can eat anything once.
I have a mushroom story also. My father and brother love mushrooms, I don't. But anyway, in Italy, my brother was out in the woods with my dad, and they found a mushroom and said, "Oh, this is good." And the Italian friend of theirs grabbed it and said, "Don't touch it." It's true. Vi raccomando, okay, here's your raccomando. It's velenoso. So it was good to eat here, and the same looked exactly the same here as it did in Italy, and the one in Italy was poisoned. So you need to, like you say, you need to go with somebody who knows what they're
Yes,
doing.
yes. We call those trickster plants, and there are a lot of them out there. Yes.
You know, many recipes are not eat mushrooms. We used to use ragu on it.
Yeah, you know, I'm really good at identifying the plants, not the best at cooking them.
Do you organize walks for mushroom picking?
I don't. I haven't organized. That was one thing that just in the honor of my grandfather, I would love to do, like, just one to go out and find oyster mushrooms. The funny thing is there's another mushroom that's more prevalent around here. It's got a lot of names. I call it the rip saddle mushroom. And it's only good to eat for a short period of time. So yeah, it's real small. They get big, but it's only good to eat for a short period of time. So that's my time. Thank you all. I invite you out to walk and talk with me tomorrow.